Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next installment in the Living Christian Faith series. An unusual new host this evening. My name is Jason Osborne, and I'm a journalist with the Irish Catholic newspaper. Father Eamon asked me to chair tonight's discussion, which is going to be on proclaiming Christian faith as a priest or religious today. And to discuss this topic, I'm joined by Father Stephen Farraher, Ballyhaunis parish priest, Sister Ursula Lawler, a lecturer in Christian ethics in Mary Immaculate College, and by Father Sean Deegan, who is a priest of the St. Patrick's Society for Foreign Mission, and last but not least, joined also by Father Eamon Conway, who so ably guided us through the last series of discussions. So thank you all very much for sitting down with us all this evening. And I suppose without further ado, because I certainly don't want to take up too much of the time this evening, I've given you a brief introduction, but if you could each maybe tell us a little about yourselves and your experience before we launch into tonight's discussion. So if you'd take us away, maybe Sister Ursula.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Well, I'm with the Presentation Sisters. I'm currently living in Thurles, County Tipperary, but I'm a native of Kildare. I've been with the Presentation Sisters since 1989, and prior to that I had spent 11 years working in Dublin Corporation as a computer programmer. And as you've heard, I'm now working as a lecturer in Christian ethics, but I've had a very varied career with the Presentation Sisters.
Fantastic. And then how about yourself, Father Sean?
Thanks very much, Jason, and good night to everybody. Yes, I belong to St. Patrick's Missionaries in Kiltegan, County Wicklow Missionary Congregation, and I'm a native of Thurles Pass, County Westmeath. I suppose in my priestly life, I've spent about half working with Kiltegan itself in administration and in formation and so on, and about the rest of it then on the missions in Brazil. And only for the COVID, I would be there at the moment as well. So that's my story at the moment.
Fantastic. I've no doubt you're doing equally good work here. And then finally, Father Stephen Farraher, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Thanks, Jason. Well, as you said in the introduction, I'm presently the parish priest of Ballyhaunis here in East Mayo, about 7 miles from Knockshrine. I'm a native of a place called the Neil. Our big claim to fame is we gave the word boycott to the English language. It'll be about a 40-minute drive away from here. The second eldest of a family of 7. My father was a small farmer in South Mayo. I was ordained in 1985 for the Archdiocese of Tuam. I went back for my first appointment. I was in charge of the boarding pupils in St. Giles College in Tuam, where I had been a boarder myself for 5 years. After that, I spent 2 years in Knock. Then I went on to do formation work in Maynooth in the seminary there. And following that, I was appointed more or less parish priest of Tuam. I was called the administrator of Tuam, the cathedral parish, called the administrator because the Archbishop of Tuam is officially the parish priest of Tuam parish as well. So I've had me there for 10 years. I was transferred here 10 years ago to Ballyhaunis, and so that's more of a brief resume of my life story so far.
Fantastic. And lest we leave you out, Father Conway, our audience ought to be well acquainted with you at this stage, but just in case they aren't, maybe you could tell us a little about yourself.
Well, thanks very much. I'm also a priest of the Tuam Diocese like Stephen, but as I say, of it, but rarely in it, as it turned out. Not by design, just by accident or providence. After I was ordained, I went to Germany. That was in 1987, so I'm only a young fella compared to Stephen Farraher there. I went to Germany and came back and was appointed to All Hallows College in Dublin, where I taught for 7 years. And then I worked in Galway for a year, developing programs at the Western Theological Institute and in GMIT. And then almost now 22 years ago, I moved to Limerick to head up a new department of what was then a new department of theology and religious studies. And I often joke that if I'd murdered somebody, I'd probably have got out by now. But anyway, 22 years of missionary work. That's how I describe it in Limerick, really. and still enjoying it and delighted to have the opportunity to do the things I do in that context.
That's fantastic. So about as wide a range of experience as you could hope to have for discussion of this nature. So without further ado, I think we'll launch into tonight's discussion. So maybe we'll start with some softer questions, if you could put it that way. But one that I think a lot of people, particularly people of faith, will be asking about today's religious, particularly during the COVID pandemic, is where each of you draw your strength from. Because of its nature, religious life is very communal, and we're living through a very isolated time. So, and even outside of that, it's a very difficult time to be Catholic, to profess any sort of strong faith. So I'd be very curious to know where each of you draws strength from for your separate ministries. How about yourself, Sister Ursula? Again, we'll start again with you.
Well, I suppose I'm very fortunate in, it was both, felt fortunate and it was both challenging. The fact that I live in a large community, there are 20 of us living in Thurles. And, when the pandemic hit first, like as a community of that size, where we would interact a lot. And then we felt at the beginning that we had to, consciously, socially distance. We kind of limited our times of coming together for prayer. And that was a huge loss. But then kind of as we adjusted a bit more and we began to find ways where we could still have that shared prayer life. And I'll have to say, I think the fact that, it's part of our way of life to depend on each other. And, we had the mantra, we're all in it together. And I suppose, while at times I found that very trite, but at other times I found the very fact that living in religious community, we do draw sustenance from each other and from some familiarity with each other's journey through life. So even seeing each other trying to cope with it and at close quarters, and realizing that this was part of, the bigger journey that we share as a religious community. That we could see this within our religious horizon as well. So that kind of shared life that we could even that we could draw on, I think that was a big support for me, realizing that the very fact that we were still trying to live under the same roof, we were still trying to, that we shared with each other how we were, managing with having access to prayer, to kind of online liturgies, whatever. That became part of our shared enterprise during COVID.
Fantastic answer. I do think it gives us a bit of an insight into what life was like for people living in community during the most unusual past year that we've had. Yourself, Father Sean, where has your source of strength been over the past year? And in your ministry in general, I should add.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I like Ursula, I live in community too, and I suppose I find, in fact, we're lucky in that sense, there's people near us, but we have the same problems, especially to say Mass. We know we like to say Mass and participate in Mass, and how do you do it safely, and, all of that discussion that goes on. And I'm really very sorry for people, I know them myself, and I've been speaking to them, who have been going to daily Mass maybe for 40 years and 50 years of their life, never missed it. And since last March, I've never been inside a church, So when I look at my own life versus that, I'm in a lucky situation. My own faith, it's funny. I mean, I don't know why. It depends on my life, where I am. I think I have great faith in Jesus Christ. I have great faith in the way that Jesus lived his life, and the message of Jesus and the proclamation of the kingdom and all the values of Jesus. They keep me going at time. Now, I don't know where God the Father comes into my life. I think when I'm really sick or I'm depressed or I don't know what the future holds, I probably turn to God, the sort of invisible God, the Father, to put my life into his hands. And I suppose the Holy Spirit is there all the time in some shape or form. But I like the Bible, and I like I really suppose get my inspiration from Jesus. I don't mean that in a fundamentalist way, but that aspect of God really keeps me going most of the time, I think.
Fantastic. I dare say the pillars of the church used as they should be. And yourself, Father Stephen, I know well, as far as I'm aware, you're not living in community out there in Ballyhaunis. So where is it you draw your strength from?
Yeah, I suppose I've divided professionally and personally. I suppose starting with the personal, first of all, in a strange way, I found the slower pace of life actually great. It gave me time for reading, time for a bit more prayer, reflection. I get out a few mornings a week for walks early in the morning. And so at that level, actually, I just found the pace nice just for reading, reflecting a bit more. We had an online retreat there with Father Billy Swan from Ferns Diocese. There were about 125 priests on a Zoom retreat held over nine evenings as well. And a group of us here in the diocese are part, we call it a supervision group. It's kind of a support group that has been in existence for 15 years. So obviously we weren't able to meet in person, but we were meeting by Zoom. It's facilitated for us by a facilitator. So at that level, as I said, just to have that little bit more stuff I put on the long finger, I would find normally out pre-COVID, the pace of life, just chasing from schools to programs to meetings, all of that, the pace of life being very fast. So the slowing down the pace, in fact, at that level, I lapped it up, you know. On the professional level, I suppose initially being thrust into the situation of going out to say Mass to an empty church. In fact, one of my parishioners, we have a webcam. Fortunately, we had a webcam in place beforehand. But one of my parishioners there was a camera behind me. The church took a photograph of that first evening, this time last year, me with saying Mass to a completely empty church. So initially it was a bit strange, but here, I suppose, because there's a local radio station, Midwest Radio, it's a very popular local radio station, really, here across the whole west of Ireland. And when churches closed down, one of the demands they had, or one of the requests for the listeners was, please, our churches are closed, can you please broadcast some Masses? So initially, the first lockdown, my Wednesday morning and Friday morning 10 o'clock Mass was broadcast. So kind of in a way, as a parish here, we had a higher profile because of COVID. But the other thing was, when we were able to reopen with 50, what really supported me was the way our parish pastoral council just took ownership and set up rotas of cleaners. We appealed for people outside the parish pastoral council to volunteer in various capacities as ushers, and just the response was extraordinary. And literally, it was great for me just to be able to go over to the church, not to worry about what was happening, who was ushering today, and just, I like to get over maybe half an hour beforehand over to the church, just to have a bit of quiet time for church to pray, before Mass to pray. So to me, that was a tremendous support that way, in which the way the Parishioners Parish Pastoral Council took ownership of looking after that whole that whole side of things. And we had a WhatsApp group and all that. So we communicated regular, people filled in for each other on various occasions where they couldn't be present. So a number of years back, I would have said to myself, when we were starting parish pastoral councils, I felt, maybe, at times it was easier to go and do the thing yourself. But really, I felt that pastoral councils, certainly here, some of my priest colleagues would have said the same, came of age when COVID started, that they took ownership of their parish and responsibilities in that regard. So that was very affirming. And at another level, and may not account for it might seem a bit trivial, but just the way that parishioners still continue to support me, their priest, financially, but also the weekly collection, even though it meant people coming here having to shove their envelopes to the letterbox in the church. So the way that people have continued right up to now to support the parish financially, the knowledge that there are still bills to be paid and all of that. So fantastic. I felt very supported at that level. So that's basically a summary, Jason. Yeah.
Thanks a million, Father. I'm nearly overwhelmed here with questions that I'd like to ask, because, as I said, we have such a variety here of backgrounds and such a wealth of experience. But I suppose because we're limited on time, I think I might dive straight into some trickier questions for you, if that's quite all right with each of you. because as I mentioned at the beginning, quite a difficult time to be any person of faith, really, I would say, in the world, but naturally from our Catholic perspectives, we would say very difficult time to be a Catholic. And as a young person, I'm sort of keenly aware of a lot of the, say, difficulties that young people might have with the church. Even if you're a young person in the church, you might have difficulty interfacing maybe with the other young people around you on these topics. So I might come to you again first, Sister Ursula, and I might ask you about the nearly, how might you put it, the hot topic, as it were, of women in the church, because we hear an awful lot about this from secular media sources. We hear an awful lot about this in books and in talks on YouTube, and I think, generally speaking, a lot of the talk has been quite off-putting, say, to women who wouldn't be particularly involved in the church. They hear things like the church treats women maybe as second-class citizens, or it sees them as second-class citizens. It doesn't have a sort of a, I suppose how I've heard it put is that the church is quite patriarchal, to put it that way. And with your experience as a religious sister, but also in intellectual life and missionary life, I wanted to know what your experience has been as a woman in the church.
Well, I suppose the word journey comes to mind when I think of my experience of being a woman in the church, like even becoming conscious of being a woman in the church, and that is, I was going to say there's something unique about that, as distinct from being a man in the church. But so I suppose like my position that way was kind of unique, being like, and I always think religious women were pioneering in the church. But along the way, let's say, particularly through my intellectual work, I did become very conscious of, the situation of women vis-a-vis men. And I'm not saying that women were disrespected in the church, or that, that I'm loath to say second-class citizens, that they were always seen as different. And, to say the church sees them as second-class citizens is to ignore the fact that, that term could apply to the way society in general saw women. And anyway, it's, a term of relatively recent origin. But I do think, like particularly from my experience now talking to younger women, through my work in Mary I and my work in other colleges over the years, there is, I feel, a pressure point, arising out of women's experience. And their need to have that experience heard, and heard, on a formal plane. Like certainly we had, a beautiful document written by John Paul II, Mulieris Dignitatem. He spoke beautifully and movingly about, a woman's vocation and the vocation of motherhood. But what is, I think, missing is like women's experience coming through from, mediated by women's voices. Like I remember that night after the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, and Archbishop Eamon Martin was being interviewed, and he was naturally very disappointed and downhearted over the result. But one thing he said was that what struck him during the course of the debate was how little he had, understood the pressure that women can feel under. Now, I'm not just talking about in relation to the issue that was the subject of the Eighth Amendment, but I think that's a difficulty that the church has to overcome if the whole church is to be renewed. So I would say that I'd be hopeful with, that the whole talk of synodality, and I know synodality is a big word, and that, we'd have to pin down what it means. But I think in Pope Francis, understanding synodality is about a new way of organising church life. And I would be very hopeful that there'll be a new way, new channels for listening to women's voices in that discussion. and that I feel there'll be new opportunities to sift what the Spirit is doing through women's experiences, with the hope of that bringing new life to the church as a whole.
Fantastic, yeah, no, and it really is. It's exactly as you say. I mean, the church has always had wonderful teachings on both a man's place and a woman's place in the church. But the key point, I suppose, as you're saying here, is the fact that it often hasn't been mediated through female voices, and maybe in a sense it lacked a certain authenticity as such. Whereas I do think this is something that's being addressed now.
Yeah, it certainly lacked. I think there was an insight lacking that could be of great benefit to the church. And I'd like to see, that finding its place. Now, as it has taken time for that to happen in many areas of life and across many cultures. So I would like to see that the time will come to hear the voice, and that the church together can sift through that experience in the way the church sifts through experience. So that would be my hope.
That's really wonderful.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, and thanks a million for sharing that. Father Sean, then, if I might turn to you next. Your experience in Brazil is it's an experience that not many people get these days. I suppose the experience, if I could put it this way, of a totally different culture, a totally different society, in a totally different way of doing things altogether. And a saying that I've heard from a couple of religious at this stage that's quite struck me. I suppose Ireland as new missionary territory. This idea of Ireland as a different culture to be evangelized. And I was wondering, your experience in Brazil, how has this sort of informed your thinking on bringing the gospel to different cultures, say? How has your experience in Brazil informed your approach I suppose, in bringing the gospel to people who think very differently to you do? How you do?
Yes, Jason. I suppose it's almost a cliche. I'd have to start off with that. When you get behind the culture, people are people. Everybody is a human being, and we all have the same longings and desires and feelings and so on. And in my experience now, having sort of half and half Brazil and Ireland, Brazil being South American and so on, the sense of God is very strong. Sense of the other world is very strong. So you're starting, from a good starting point. The colonizer was Catholic, so there's a strong Catholic ethos down there in South America. So the priest and the church is very welcome and has a very strong credibility. Like in Brazil, in my experience of the institutions in the country with credibility, the church is always in the top three. So it's a particular situation. I find, I just hinted at yourself there, Ireland is a missionary country, I think, now. It's because there's so many mixtures, I suppose, in Ireland. But as a priest or as a church, I would have experienced probably more cynicism and ridicule in Ireland than I ever would have had in Brazil. Never would have experienced that sort of thing at all. Now Ireland has particular history, and the last 30, 40 years is a very particular history too, So how do you love God and love your neighbour and love yourself? That's the three legs of the Christian life in Ireland at the moment, and how can the church get that message across? I myself think that, and I don't want to be lecturing the Irish situation, that everybody's interested, even Stephen, down in your parish, the future is laity. Traditionally in Ireland, I think, through nobody's fault, just because we had too many priests, just literally we had too many priests, and the sacrament of Holy Orders was valued an awful lot more than the sacrament of baptism. And we have theologians here tonight will tell us that baptism is the primary sacrament, So we baptized millions of people, but we didn't encourage them or cultivate that seed to grow at all. It just died, But that, I think, events it's funny, events have changed that in Ireland. I think I heard somebody saying sometime recently, 50 years ago, Granny would have been very happy to see her grandson becoming a priest. Today, Granny would be very happy if she saw her grandson being baptized. So, we've made that jump in 40 to 50 years. So whether we like it or not, baptism, and I don't know how sincere it is, some cases, but there's a big, during the summer, even there, during the few months of ease of lockdown, I was in a parish, there was a backlog of baptisms. People want to get baptized for some reason. And, it's just saying something. But so that's it, I think, the future will be to cultivate baptism. Lay people have done, if we sit down, have done all the great things. We're here because of Knock tonight. Who, as I say, founded Knock? It was lay people. Who founded all the great Marian shrines in the world? It was lay people. Who started all the great pilgrimages that we know of in the world? It was lay people. Who canonized the popular saints before they were canonized by Rome? It was the lay people. And, even in the last few months there, the Pope officially declared women, this topic again, we're talking about there could be readers and there could be acolytes or whatever in the church. Well, the lay people have been doing that for 50 years since the Vatican Council. It's happening in parishes, not because some bishop demanded that we have girl altar servers. They just happen. So, in a sense, I think that's our Irish culture. That's happening I don't want to say Brazil is an ideal. It's not an ideal church at all. But I suppose I learned that element there. And I think it is the future. Priests strayed into the laity's territory. So I think the laity now, it's time for the laity to reclaim their territory. And this is my last point. I am not sure because I'm not a canon lawyer or anything. But when it's stripped down, I believe that the things reserved, especially for a priest, is to say mass, to hear confessions, and to anoint the sick, I think. Now, I stand open to correction. So that's just it. That's all. So baptism, weddings, funerals, parish administration, all the other things can be done by lay people. And I've seen them done by lay people. But I suppose just in Ireland, because we had the number of priests, they trespassed into all of those areas and take them over. So that would be the way I would think about the sort of living out the Christian message or preaching the Christian message in the culture of Ireland today, from having learned from another culture, I suppose.
Absolutely. Absolutely fascinating. Father Stephen, then, we'll turn to you next. And we just had a fantastic answer from Father Sean about the sort of bringing the gospel to different cultures. And I suppose living out your faith in a way that's quite true to experience, or I suppose the church being quite true to people's experience. And I suppose if we're going to be true to experience and true to the world we live in, we have to acknowledge the presence of other faiths these days. And this is something that I think Pope Francis is quite strong on. And I know yourself in Ballyhaunis, you have quite a strong Muslim population over there. So I think interfaith dialogue is probably a very real reality. It's a reality for you. It's a real experience for you. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about that, and if you've been successful in your efforts, and maybe what you've learned in terms of reaching out to people of other faiths.
Well, I think first of all, Jason, it's very topical because obviously all the events that happened last weekend when Pope Francis met with the man who's regarded as, I suppose, the Pope of Shia Muslims, namely the Ayatollah al-Sistani. And in his talk, when he went to visit Ur, or the birthplace of Abraham, one of the lines in his talk, Pope Francis says, "Anyone who believes in God has no enemies to fight." And I think it's very profound because basically Abraham is regarded as the father of the three world religions. And of course, Pope Francis's trip last day was made possible because in 1986, one of his predecessors, Pope John Paul II, brought the leaders of world religion to Assisi in 1986, which didn't meet with approval from a lot of Catholics at the time. And I think even Pope Benedict who was Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, said he wasn't enthusiastic about it at the time, but later began to agreed it was a worthwhile move. So I know Pope John Paul would have loved to have gone there and expressed a wish to go so in 1999, just before the eve of the millennium, but it didn't prove possible at the time. So coming more local, yes, you're right, we have a big Muslim community here. And strangely, my first visit to Ballyhonus here, before ever I was ordained, I told you that my father was a small farmer and we kept sheep. And my first trip here to Ballyhonus was driving my father's tractor here to bring some land to halal meats here in Ballyhonus, which was started by a Pakistani businessman called Sher Rafiq. Sher Rafiq was a self-made millionaire before he came to Ballyhonus, and actually he'd made his money from mining. But that is a story itself, an extraordinary story how he came here, because he said he saw that the people here in the west of Ireland, hard-working, honest people, were very similar to his own people in Pakistan, where he came from, that all that were needed was leadership. So I know he provided great prices for sheep and cattle here in the west of Ireland, and he was very respected. He told me that after he arrived here in Ballyhonus in 1976, he approached the then parish priest, who I think was Canon McGarry, who founded the Furrow magazine that would be familiar to a lot of people. And he asked Canon McGarry, he said, look, I am a Pakistani businessman setting up a business here in the town. I'm a Muslim. He says, I'm looking for somewhere to say my prayers. Would it be okay if I said my prayers in your church? Now, this is back in the 1970s, and Canon McGarry says you are most welcome to come into the church at any time to say your prayers. And Mr. Rafiq told me what an impression it made on him. And his sons and the first Pakistani families that arrived here obviously went to the local primary school. One of his sons won a prize this time of the year for an essay on St. Patrick. And after that, he went on, his children went on, two sons went on to be educated by the Jesuits in Clongowes College in Kildare. So anyway, it was practical ecumenism long before, or interfaith dialogue long before it ever was talked about. So I find here, like some of the families here have been here for 50 years. They speak with Mayo accents. A lot of them play hurling and football with the local clubs. The local club here. When I go into the primary school, 1/3 of some of the classes can be Muslim children. So when I go in there during Lent, I talk to them. Our Lent is a bit like your Ramadan. So I try to see what we have in common rather than what differentiates us. And the more I've dialogued, the families invite me to their homes on different occasions, the important feasts, festivals in their faith, which is around Eid or whatever at the end of Ramadan. And the more, like what Sean said earlier about Brazil, people are human. During the COVID here, one of the first people to die was a young Muslim girl, Sally Maz. And later, just a number of months back, another young Muslim lad who was a very friendly lad. I used to meet him up here in the community school. His body was taken from the River Shannon. There was some tragedy there. He was a student in Limerick. Now, the tears of both those families were no different to the tears of grief of a Catholic mother or an atheist mother in that regard. And so I've found the more I dialogue with my Muslim neighbours here, I realise their sense of the transcendent, their living a moral life. I think they have a huge amount to teach us with regard to being able to celebrate without alcohol. So I think it has been a very enriching experience for us here. So this time last year, again, when I go into the schools, in the secondary school here, I find them taking part. There's great interaction. So the real work of integration goes on quietly in our schools and in the various communities, voluntary organisations in our parish here. So so this time last year, at the start of the COVID lockdown, I was approached by some members of the community that I know well here, wondering, look, this virus, this threat to humanity doesn't respect creed, it doesn't respect class, it doesn't respect anything. Is there any way we could have a joint prayer of blessing? So I think some people will be aware what I'm going to say after that. It didn't meet with the approval of people. I got a lot of vicious stuff online and on the phone, but all of that from people who didn't approve and of what I had done. And again, it was followed up here by a group arriving outside the church on the 15th of August, protesting basically that what I had done didn't certainly meet with their approval, but the vast majority of the reaction I got in the 15th of August was people who were so supportive. I had a letter from a young doctor who I knew when she was a student in Tuam the hospital she works in, she works with a lot of Muslim female doctors, and she said the same. The more I converse with those young women, the more I realise we have in common rather than what differentiates us. So that's a little bit of, I hope that answers the question you asked, Jason.
Well, certainly does. No, it's a fascinating insight from the front lines, if I were to put it that way. It really is, because it's a reality people just didn't have to contend with maybe even a couple of decades ago. So I really do appreciate you sharing that with everyone. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time here. Father Eamon, I hope you're not sort of feeling neglected or hard done by over there. We've just had so many contributions, I suppose, to get through. But if I could call you in maybe for some practicalities at the moment, so you could tell us a little about what's coming up next.
Yeah, well, so thank you. First of all, thank you, Jason, for leading the questioning tonight. I thought it'd be good to have somebody of your vintage, if I can say that, of your age, to engage with us and just, as you know, ask the questions that would be live questions for people of your generation. I really appreciate you doing that, and it was a delight to be part of the audience for me to be a part of the audience tonight. And that, like that, there are lots of questions I would love to have engaged with, and I think we just got a flavour of the richness of the variety of experience that is here. And indeed, I'm coming away with a sense of how alive the church is in its various forms, and there's huge hope for the Irish church. There really is, and we need to voice that more. We need to share that more with one another. I do think we have to learn an awful lot from the missionary experience that Father Sean spoke about. In our warm-up for this, which we did a few days ago, Sean, you used an important phrase. You said there are different ways of being Catholic besides being an Irish Catholic. And I think that's something maybe we do, and Pope Francis wants us to learn that much more now, that we learn from various experiences of church. So we're a receiving church now. In the past, we were a sending church, and we're a receiving church. And it's wonderful to have the voice of Sister Ursula as a presentation sister, who I'm a very close and dear colleague to me in the department, and Stephen as well. I think that's such a rich experience. So thank you all, to all of you. Just wanted to say a word that for next week, we're going back to Maury Immaculate. It's our last week. I wanted I think it's very interesting for people to know that 3 people who are doing PhDs, doctoral students with me, all in various walks of life. We have Judith King, who's a very accomplished psychotherapist, and she's been doing a fascinating dissertation on the Camino and Loch Derg, and the whole idea of what's happening in your body as you pilgrimage, as you're a pilgrim. And she's done some really, I think, groundbreaking research on that over the last 3 years she's been with us. Margaret Naughton is a chaplain in a hospital in the south west, and Margaret is doing a thesis on what it's like to be a hospital chaplain. I think particularly now in the COVID times, this would have been very interesting. But really looking at what's the personal faith of chaplains, where are they coming from in terms of their own faith? And again, in many instances, it's an interfaith exploration that she's doing. And then the third one is Maury Mcdonald, who has just finished her PhD. She graduated last October. Maury is the vice principal of a very busy secondary school in Dublin. And she was looking at what is the understanding of Catholic faith among Catholic school principals. So she did a lot of original research in that. So that's what we'll share with people, a little bit of that. Again, we won't get too much, but we'll get a little bit of that when we speak to each other this time next week. So thank you, and back over to you again, Jason.
Thanks a million. So I won't take the limelight for too long. Sister Ursula, if you wouldn't mind leading us in a prayer to finish off the evening.
Okay, Jason, I have chosen a piece from the prophet Isaiah. I suppose I'm very conscious at the moment that there is such huge anxiety in the world. There's anxiety about COVID. There's anxiety watching and waiting for the vaccine. There's anxiety about work. So this is a piece that I have found, as you asked a question earlier on about what gives you support. This is a piece that I have found has often given me support in times of anxiety. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Stop being anxious and watchful, for I am your God. I give you strength. I bring you help. I uphold you with my victorious right hand. For I, the Lord your God, I am holding you by the right hand. I tell you, do not be afraid, I will help you. Do not be afraid, Jacob, poor creature. Israel, poor thing. I will help you. It is the Lord who speaks. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. Amen.
Amen. So thank you all so much for your contributions tonight, and I would like to thank our audience for joining us and hopefully for going away and ruminating on this and allowing it to imbue their own Christian lives. I think we'll leave it there for tonight, so thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Jason.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.